Welcome to the Faith and Feelings podcast. My name is Taylor Joy, and I'm passionate about helping you untangle and honor your emotions, authentically practice your faith, and integrate both into your everyday life so that you can experience the goodness and delight that comes from living in relationship with yourself, God, and others. Thank you for joining me. Let's get started. For most of us, feelings are messy. Oftentimes, we don't have words for what we're feeling, and we can get stuck in a dark and painful place. Because emotions can be so complicated, many of us manage, minimize, avoid, drown in, or dismiss them entirely. We have so many strategies to not feel what we feel, but this often leaves us with a sense of numbness. We feel confused and chopped up inside. Giving our feelings language is like turning on the lights. It's how we begin to wake up to wholeness, to beauty, and to our own hearts again. Learning to notice, name, and process what we're feeling is also a key vehicle for growing in self-awareness. That's what author and spiritual director Anjuli Paschall and I talk about today. Anjuli brings such profound depth, vulnerability, and wisdom to this conversation. There were a few moments where I was processing so deeply that I forgot we were recording. This is definitely an episode that you're going to want to savor slowly, take notes, and then listen to again. So let's go to my conversation now with Anjuli. Well, Anjuli, welcome to Faith and Feelings.
Hey there, it's so good to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm so glad you're here. Well, this is one of several conversations that we're starting on the podcast all about self-awareness. And I know I mentioned this when we connected on Instagram a few months ago, but both of your books, Stay and Feel, have impacted me so much. You write beautifully about feelings, and especially through your most recent book, Feel, you offer language for our emotions that I think is such an important part of growing in self-awareness. So to get started, I'm curious to know about your own relationship with feelings. Can you tell me a little bit about your younger self and what your relationship with feelings has been like in the past?
Sure. I grew up as in a home where feelings were not necessarily emphasized or valued or acknowledged. Now, that's not to say there were some feelings that were praised, and there were certainly some feelings that were kind of minimized or shamed, I would say. So, for instance, excuse me, happiness was a high value in our home. Play was a high value, while sadness and anger were really set aside. And if we as kids, or if I expressed those feelings, they were acknowledged briefly, but then corrected quickly. So I think that was a lot of family culture. I grew up with a really strong Asian family. And then in our church culture, it was just not a feelings. I can't even remember one sermon or one message on feelings. And it wasn't even like feelings are bad. It just wasn't even mentioned. And so I just had very little knowledge or information on what they were and what to do with them. Except for be happy and don't be angry or sad. That it's so simple. It was so simple.
Yes. Yeah. When I was really little, I started writing when I was like 4 or 5 years old. And I used to have a lot of different journals. And the first one was a prayer journal.
Yeah.
And every morning I would get up and write letters to God, expressing gratitude and thanksgiving. And then I would open my personal journal where all of my emotions and thoughts and feelings would just come out.
Interesting.
And in my like 6 or 7-year-old mind, that was the journal that God would never see.
Oh.
And so one journal held,
right?
Yeah, one journal held my pain and the other journal held my praise. And I didn't know how to talk to God about both. And, I don't think I had the language for that, but I was categorizing good and bad emotions. I know you're going to say something. What were you going to say about that?
Oh, no. And it's like, I wonder, some of that perhaps is like influenced by the outside.
Yeah.
outside influences, I'm sure. But then sometimes it's just like this internal compartmentalizing our lives that I think we do. Like a physical journal is like a physical manifestation of what many of us are doing internally all the
Yes.
time. Yeah.
Yes. But in your book, Feel, and I loved this part of the book so much. You write about how you've been on a journey of learning that feelings are neither right nor wrong, but a guide to wholeness and a pathway to prayer. So, how has your relationship with God maybe changed or deepened as you've been on this journey? And what are some things maybe that you've learned about Him and His heart?
Yeah. I think growing up with my framework and understanding of feelings, it directly influenced my prayer life, right? So I could never, oh my goodness, ever talk to my dad about my feelings. That was just, it was just like, it would have been so weird, like, like he was just so focused on, behavior and so focused on his own work, and it it just was not even a category to come to my dad if I was sad, like. And so I think very naturally I just transferred that onto God, like, oh, I'm not going to talk to God about feelings, that's like weird or strange. It's like I'm going to talk to God about um these practical things. And so um, I think I just developed an implicit belief that God didn't care about my feelings. I mean, I didn't care about them. Why would anybody else care about them? That was, I think, the thinking. And so I remember maybe it was a professor who said feelings are like they're always true. You know, they don't always tell you what to do. That would be like a dangerous way to understand feelings. But that you feel sad, mad, glad, or bad, that's a true thing. And it's a real discerning process of how to interpret those and what they mean in your life. But it was actually quite um, freeing, I would say, to go on that journey where feelings were irrelevant to feelings being relevant, and now where I'm at of feelings being an absolute necessity in my prayer life. And I would even go in so far as to say, like, it's biblical.
Yeah.
It's biblical to pray your feelings. Um, it's biblical to pour out your heart to God. You look at every single character in the Bible, from the New Old Testament to the New Testament. It's these heroes of the faith who are absolute failures in reality most of the time, who are crumbling under their poor character. But that transformation happens in the innermost parts of their being when their souls open up their hearts to God, and God meets them in those deep down places. So it was quite a journey to go from feelings being stuffed and guilty for even feeling things to, oh wait, pay attention to what that feeling might be informing me about what's going on in my heart. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so good. I'm wondering, can you say a little bit more about what that journey looked like?
Yeah. It was so probably in my mid 20s, and I write about this in Stay, I think. Um, I went on a retreat. I went on a 3-week isolated retreat. And the emphasis and focus of this retreat was really an invitation to be connected to early childhood experiences and the feelings that I had and the emotions I had connected to those experiences. And so I spent just, gosh, a long, miserable, painful, hard 21 days just primarily alone in a cabin on an island in the middle of nowhere. And I would meet with a therapist slash spiritual director for an hour a day, where really what we have to often do to protect ourselves in pain is we just build a wall. And so when we have experiences or trauma or abuse, what we usually do is just build up a wall and just move forward. And the whole purpose of that retreat was break down that wall. And part of that breaking was feeling my anger and feeling my fear and feeling my sadness and all these feelings I had never allowed myself to feel. And so I would say that was a huge catalyst of like, oh
Yeah.
my gosh, the power and the gift of anger changed my life. It's like the best
Wow.
gift that anyone, God, could have ever given me. And the gift of sadness and the gift of pain and the gift of actually anxiety was so transformative on my healing journey.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. I'm thinking about you in that cabin. What was maybe one of the primary emotions that began to surface as you began to feel?
I would say probably, it's so funny. I loved writing feel because I had got to have so many conversations with people about their feelings. And for me, sadness is a very accessible feeling. And I like it, you know? So for me on my retreat, the first thing I felt was sad.
Yeah.
Because it was almost felt like a comfort blanket. Like
Yeah.
it felt like home. Like, oh, this feels so nice. It's funny because some people just like hate sadness. And then probably the next one was fear. And then the next one was anger. Anger is just the hardest one for me to access. But yeah, it was kind of layered like that.
Yeah. So anger was the hardest to feel.
Yeah. It's so violent. Anger is a really violent feeling, and it feels very out of control. And that's a scary feeling. And I think witnessing anger growing up that felt out of my control, it just is so uncomfortable.
Yeah. Yeah. When you think about this journey that you've been on of learning to feel, what are some obstacles? Where have you gotten stuck on the journey?
Oh, all the time, every day. um, I think one of the place, probably after having kids and just such an identity shift in being single, then married, and then kids, you just lose so much of your sense of true north. It's such a uprooting experience that I would say for several years I just felt numb. And so I would say any of the big life transition, numbness really, uh, which is like the absence of feeling, but it's also the feeling of like probably avoidance and probably grasping for control. I don't even want to say being numb is bad. Being numb is kind of a scary feeling because you feel so disconnected.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, yeah, maybe to answer your question, some of the stumbling blocks are life transitions where your life or sudden change where your life keeps going, but your heart is stuck like 6 months ago. And so having to like go back and figure out like, oh, what happened? Like, oh yeah, there was grief there. I just didn't grieve. And sometimes it's survival, you know? A lot of times numbness is like anesthesia for survival. And so, yeah, I think I've noticed that in my life that anytime a big transition happens, I have to be more attentive to like what I'm experiencing internally.
Yeah. When you think about going through different life transitions and maybe even going back and thinking about like the grief 6 months ago that I didn't feel, what are some maybe rhythms or practices that have been helpful in beginning to name and process those emotions? Do you feel called to write? There's a creative part of you that comes alive whenever you think about putting your story into words to share with others. But another part of you doubts yourself. You wonder if you could ever write a whole book and get it published. It feels overwhelming, and you have no idea where to start. Do you know that I offer writing coaching? As an author of 3 books with 13 years of experience in the publishing industry, I want to help you feel empowered to craft your truest, deepest writing so you can confidently share your story and the unique message that God has placed inside of you. You can learn more through the link in the show notes.
Oh gosh, that's such a good question. I think the biggest step, for me at least, is to acknowledge that before I can get to the grief, I have to bypass self-condemnation or shame. Because oftentimes we can't even get to our grief because we have another voice there that's saying, "What's wrong with you? Why are you still dealing with this? How come you're not better yet? Everyone else seems like they can do just fine." And so I think the sister, the evil stepsisters of guilt and shame, kind of acknowledging them and setting them aside, so you can access, or I can access, the grace and love of God for, the pain I've experienced or the loss that I am still not ready to let go of. That makes sense.
Oh, that's so good. Yeah. Thinking about my story, self-condemnation has been a pretty big theme. And in different life transitions, like you've been saying, or even just with my journey with anxiety and an eating disorder in high school, coming to these places where I'm confronted with reality and confronted with myself in different ways, and having to really wrestle with the self-condemnation that is just comes in waves.
Yeah.
Like over top of God's invitation to feel in deeper ways.
Yeah. They truly are evil stepsisters. Guilt and shame. I find most people and myself spend a lot of their energy wrestling with guilt and shame, and they can't even get to the real core issue. And you see this, you see this in Romans 7, right? This wrestle that Paul has, right? Why do I do what I don't want to do? I don't want to do what I do want to do. Like one of the most brilliant theologians in scripture, right? He's like doing what we do here, now in present time of, why can't I do this? I know the right thing to do. Like beating that, right? That beating, that wrestling. And then you see, right, you come to Romans 8 and it's that beautiful passage where it's like, nor height nor depth nor any other created thing can separate us from the love of God. And it's like, if we can set the self-condemnation aside, wow, the access to God's love is so present and so available for whatever the condition and the core root of the problem is that we're dealing with.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good.
Such a beautiful invitation right there.
Yeah. I'm thinking about the person listening who might be feeling self-condemnation right now, who might have those evil step sisters of guilt and shame. What would you say to that person who maybe just feels like they're drowning in self-condemnation, and no matter what they do, they can't seem to feel the love and grace of God?
It's a great question. Right, for the person who is deeply lonely, right? And what they actually feel is shame or guilt because they can't figure out how to belong, right? Everyone else seems to belong somewhere. Why can't I just figure it out or be better or change? What's wrong with me? I would say to her, where is God? Where is God? And how is God inviting you to open your heart to Him with the sadness that is within you? Um, I think there's a part of me that would almost bypass. I don't even want to really acknowledge the shame. I don't want to give that shame more energy.
Mm.
It's already stolen so much of her worth. That, I mean, I think it varies from person to person, but I think I would just invite them to find the safety and love of God in the sadness they're experiencing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I kind of think that's what God does with us, right? The way God views us is through the blood of Jesus Christ. Like, he doesn't see. I think about like transparency paper, right? It's like when you put that in front of someone, like, that's what Jesus is when he sees you. Like, he still sees you through that, but he sees Jesus through you. And so when he does that, it's like, oh, Jesus is covering that shame. Jesus is covering that sin if there is a sin issue, and what Jesus is actually after is, oh, I see your loneliness. And I know what loneliness feels like.
Mm.
And you don't need to be alone in what you're experiencing.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so good. Sometimes when I've been in that space, I've had people sit with me who have gotten curious with me about how I see God. Like, what is my perception of how God sees me right now? Like, what is my perception of his facial expression, the look in his eyes? And that has always been really telling for me in moments of really deep self-condemnation. Like, how does God see me?
Yes.
Well, another thing that I loved that you wrote about in your book, Feel, is you write that every feeling has a story. I loved this so much. So I'm wondering if you could give us an example of a recent experience when you were able to identify the emotion that you were feeling and then trace the story.
Sure. Yeah. I just came back from some time away with some people, and, just in listening to some people share their stories and their experiences, I noticed at one point I started like tearing up when someone was sharing, and I was like, what's happening? Like, and as she was sharing the grief over the loss of a friend, it was like, oh, yeah, I share that grief,
Mm-hmm.
like a friendship breakup and things changing. And right, so it was that feeling actually has like if you think about thread, right, feeling is woven through the story. And I remember just like, okay, gosh, I didn't realize I was still sad about that. Something from a decade ago. It's like, oh, I guess I am still sad, And so sometimes we have these present day experiences, but they're very much, we're living out of our past. And so paying attention to those feelings and how they're activated, even watching a movie, right? You're watching a movie and it's not even, those aren't even real stories necessarily or real life people.
Yeah.
But it's like, oh, that feeling tells a story. And so we have to be really good listeners of our own story.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Really good listeners of our own story. Can you say a little bit more about how to begin tracing the story? Like if I'm feeling sadness right now, how would I begin tracing this story?
Oh, I think you even mentioned this, but ask good questions.
Hmm.
When was the last time I felt this way? Have I ever shared this with anybody? Does anyone know what you're experiencing? When did you feel this last? Yeah, things like that. Um, how are you tempted to respond to your own feeling?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we have very strong temptations when we feel things we don't want to feel. And so,
Yeah.
what are you tempted to do right now to escape what you're experiencing?
Mm. Yeah. Such good questions. When you think about this process of learning to notice and name and process emotions, How do you think this helps us grow in self-awareness?
In every way.
Yeah.
In every way. Yeah, I think it's the sense of I grew up very much in the tradition in our church of it's all God knowledge, which is so good. Scripture knowledge, God knowledge. Um, but what I came to understand is self knowledge, right? It's like there's a double knowledge. If I only know God, I will. In that sense, it's like very likely I will be prone to pride because I'm not aware of what's going on in my own heart and on my own soul. But gosh, with any relationship, it's a I know you and you know me. And so how can I present myself to God if I don't know who I am that I'm presenting? And so you have to engage in the deeper soul work so you can actually have a meaningful, intimate relationship with God.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so good. What are you doing personally right now to continue catalyzing self-awareness in your own life?
Yeah, I love that you brought that up because I think it's so dangerous to get to a place where we say we've arrived.
Mm-hmm.
And I think everyone does this at some level, right? Like, oh, I figured that out. Oh, I've processed that really traumatic thing. Oh, I don't need to deal with that anymore. And I think so many of us think that our stories are like a race where there's a finish line. And I just think it's more like, I don't know, this is not the best image, but it's coming to mind but like a laundry pile where there's it's like internal and it's never ending, where it's like always like the soul doesn't have a floor, it's like
Yeah.
it's always growing and always discovering and always learning. And any time I get to a place of like, oh, I'm done, I got it, I'm good, I figured it out. It's like a little ping of warning to me of like, oh, there's always more. There's always more to heal. And so I think the thing I'm learning right now, which is active, is confession. Shame in secret just grows. But the thing that we're ashamed of, if we speak it, actually shame is silenced. And so just continually with people in my life that I trust and my husband, it's like, I got to tell you something, you know? Oh, I don't want to tell you this, but I need to tell you this. And it's remarkable how like shame just sheds off of you when you do that. And so, yeah, I think that's the most present thing I'm doing to stay in the light.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. Well, I'm just so thankful for this conversation today. I'm really grateful for your time and just sharing some of your story and what you're learning about God and yourself on the journey. So, yeah, thank you so much for your time today, Anjuli.
Yeah. Thanks, Taylor. It was great meeting you and chatting. Loved it.
Wasn't that just so beautiful? One of the questions Anjuli asked that I've been reflecting on is how can I present myself to God if I don't know who I am that I'm presenting? I've been thinking about how often I can come into the presence of God, but completely dismiss myself from the equation. I long for transformation, but if I only bring part of myself to God, I'll only experience part of the transformation. That's why self-awareness is so important. The more aware we become of ourselves and our own hearts, the more of ourselves we can bring to God, knowing and encountering Him in these places. After our recording, I asked Anjuli one more question. How do you react or feel when you make a mistake? Her answer is really beautiful. I'll be including this short video in my Substack, which is a weekly resource email that I send out every Wednesday. To watch this video and hear more of my reflections on today's episode, you can subscribe through the link in the show notes. I'm so grateful that you listened to today's episode. Thank you for spending time with me. I'd love to hear from you. Connect with me on Instagram at TaylorJoy or through my website, taylorjoymurray.co. Also, if you enjoyed this conversation, it would mean so much to me if you took a minute to subscribe and review the podcast. This is an easy way to partner with me and is invaluable in reaching new listeners. Until next week.